'Twas ever thus, as the text so indicates. And we might at this time reflect upon it and reflect upon our shared religious experience. For our shared religious experience is one that we can start off at the very beginning of the book of Genesis, for in the cycle of readings we're now really near the very end of that book. Everything is good in each of the days of creation. God creates and it is good. God creates day 1, day 2, day 3, and infrastructure is set into place, and that infrastructure is such that by the time one gets to the 6th day, one is now able to sustain life as we would begin to understand it, human life. Human life wasn't possible when there was emptiness and void. Human life wasn't possible before there were the fish and the birds. Human life wasn't possible before there were the grasses and the trees and the seeds and the fruit. But when it comes to human life, God creates, and the Hebrew says, Tov Ma'od. The creation of the human is not just good, but very good. What has happened to the very good of humanity that is God's creation? We begin to look into the book of Genesis and we see deception, we see murder, we see people dissembling, and we set into place something that continues from then to Newtown, Connecticut to now. And we have to reflect upon that and understand. Why is it that Abraham, in order to save his own tush, is the same person who would put his wife in jeopardy from Avimelech? Why is it that, as we just read in this story, we find the circumstance of Esau not receiving the blessing of the firstborn and Jacob taking his place? Why is there favoritism in families? Why was there murder almost at the beginning of the human experience in the story of Cain and Abel? Why is it that God had to wash away in the flood almost of humanity? What's going on with the human experience, with human ambition, with human drive? What's going on with humanity from then to now? Are we not revisiting the human family in all of its circumstance? And we don't have to look just at the early stages of Genesis. You can look within your own Christian tradition. Look at the destruction that went on between Catholic and Protestants in Europe for so many centuries, the battles of wars. Look at the destruction of Hagia Sophia, Constantinople, by the Crusaders against the Eastern Orthodox, etc. Look at what is going on in Islam today between the Sunnis and the Shiites, and the battles that take place. In all of these circumstances, in Judaism and Christianity and Islam, what has happened to the human experience that has turned it in the way? Is it ambition? Is it power? Is it greed? Is it self-aggrandizement? What is it that we have to examine? After all, you are in the Advent season, so it's time to be adventurous. Look into what the season represents and juxtapose it to the reality of the world in which we live. I would submit to you for your reflection this morning that we live in a world of increasing lack of civility. People have lost their sense of civility. People no longer even have the vocabulary by which to articulate their words and their thoughts. They're expressed in grunts and noises and groans, but they're not expressed in verbiage. Educators tell us that a generation or so ago, children in primary school had twice the vocabulary that children have today. What is it that has brought that about, that we aren't able to articulate to each other, that would bring about the tragedies that we see again and again and again? The lack of civility, the lack of humanity, the lack of caring. The Christmas season, the end now yesterday, the Hanukkah season, all talk about the notion of bringing light and good into the world. And yet it's against the backdrop of killing and murder And in the case of Connecticut, the tragedy of the killing, the murder of little children. What is it about our humanity? What is it about our circumstance? What is it about us that we need to stop and reflect and examine? The reason I put it in the biblical tradition was to say this is not new. The Bible tells these stories. Our shared religious experience tells of these stories. What is it about our humanity that brings us to this stage today? And what are we prepared to do about it? Are we prepared to go back to business as usual? Are we prepared to pay lip service? Or are we prepared to really enter into serious dialogue about the changes that are needed, not just in gun laws, but the changes that are needed in our culture? The changes that are needed in our culture that bring civility and kindness, rather than ambition and hurt and pain to each other. After all, if our leaders are allowed to get away with it, that sends a message to all of us. If someone, a congressperson, can stand up at the State of the Union message in front of a national audience when the President of the United States is speaking and shout out, "You lied," what does that say about respect? When the entertainment industry produces individuals whose response to humanity is such as to be a vulgarization of humanity and are allowed to get away with it because they're entertainers, or sports figures likewise, what does that say about the people who are the ones that our children and we look up to and idolize? Are they the American idols? This is what our society needs to stop and examine. Our culture, the respect, to see God's divinity in every human being, whether you tend to make that person a personal friend or not. Whether that person's skin is white or black or green or purple or red or brown. It makes no difference. All children of God. Where are we in all of this? Why, indeed, has there been a 40% increase in the sale of guns since Obama's been president? Could it have something to do that black man is going to take away our guns? What is it about us? What is it about our culture? And what do we need to do to think about this in order to bring about change? In order to change the world? We begin to need to look within ourselves to begin to change the world. We start by changing ourselves. The sage Hillel said it long ago. I don't suppose any of you have heard any Hebrew this morning since breakfast. So let me share a little, because we don't want to get to lunch without it. Hillel said, if I'm not for myself, who will be for me? If I'm only for myself, what am I? If not now, when? 3 parts to Hillel's statement. If I'm not for myself, who's going to be for me? Yes, we need to have an ego. Yes, we need to have a sense of self. Yes, it is okay to feel good about oneself, because if we don't feel good about ourselves, who can feel good about us on our behalf? So it's all right to feel good about who we are. Yet, second phrase, if I'm only for myself, what am I? And I think that's part of our problem. It's the number one. We live in a world of lists. Everybody's got to have their Andy Warhol's 15 minutes of fame or shame. Indeed. We live in that world. Number one. Who cares about number 3? Who ever heard of number 5? Number 19? Where is that person on the list? It's number 1 or nothing. If I'm only for myself, what am I? Can we all be number 1 at the same time? And so we've got to stop and say, what does that mean? It means we become selfish. We become self-absorbed. And in our self-absorption and our selfishness, we lack our ability to understand and respect and see that others who may think differently, who may live differently, are also children of God as we are. And then, of course, the kicker, the last part of Hillel's phrase, if not now, when? What better time to think about this than during the Advent season, during the Christmas season, during the Hanukkah season, during the winter season, at the beginning of a new year? What better time to think about these things than now? Do we need more tragedies, such as Newton in Connecticut? Do we need more tragedies such as that deranged person who slashed out and knifed several dozen children in China only again in the last couple days. The tragedy of the mall in Portland. And on it goes. What do we need to do to begin to change? We need to look into our culture, and our culture is not only the gun laws. On earth, what does an individual need with a semi-automatic assault weapon? What does an individual need? Even a person who shoots for sport, to shoot at a target. Do you need a gun that rapid fires and shoots many bullets in seconds? What have we learned about ourselves and each other? And by the way, even, and I know this may upset some, even the hunters. When I hunt, I go to Trader Joe's. When I hunt, I go to New Frontiers. I go to Vaughn's. I go to Ralph. I pick and choose there. I'm no longer living out in the bush. I don't need to kill animals to sate my desire. Do you? Do we? Is that where it's at? Is that what we need to feel aggrandized and to feel who we are? We might examine it, and let alone the laws and the lack of background checks and all of the issues that confronts. But more than just that, what violence do our children grow up with on TV? What about all these little handheld games that our children, I think about our own grandchildren. What little games do they grow up with? When indeed, you're learning to dispose of things. You're learning to kill the object on the screen. When you kill the object on the screen, you lose your sense. You become anesthetized. That object might be a living thing, a human being, whatever. What is it about our culture, our language, our lack of tolerance, our lack of respect for difference? It's easy to respect people that you agree with. How about respecting people you don't agree with? How do we articulate those things? Those should be, I would suggest, the thoughts that we should be thinking about at this time of the year, in light of the horrible tragedy in Connecticut. We should be thinking about the horrible tragedy that we have out of our shared religious experience through the thousands of years brought to this point. We pay lip service in the church, in the synagogue, in the cathedral, in the mosque, to the ideals. But there's a disparity between the ideal and the real. What religion is supposed to do, ladies and gentlemen, at least in my view, is to point out the difference between what we claim to believe and what we actually do. The disparity between where we are and where we claim to like to be. How do we close that gap? We close that gap not in this room. This room only inspires us. Not in the temple down the street, in that room either. We do it in the parking lot of the shopping center when someone takes the last space. We do it when somebody cuts in front of us in the line at the checkout. We do it in the courtesies we provide to each other in our own homes. We do it out in the world, the arena of life with other human beings. That's where we take what we learn here or there or elsewhere in our respective religious houses of worship and put it into play in the arena of the human experience. That's how we change the world. Pious platitudes don't do it. Living action is what does it. The arena of life and experience. I would submit to you it is time for us to examine our culture, the words we share, the vulgarities our children are exposed to in the media, and that we are exposed to as well. The cacophony of sound that has become just a clatter of screaming heads yelling at each other as we see in Washington, D.C., and Sacramento, and everywhere else on the screen. The polarities of the Judge Judys and all the like types of shows that allow us to be voyeurs into other people's disharmony and misery. That allows us to sit on the sidelines and enjoy somebody else's discomfiture. We need to look deeply into where we are as human beings. Because the tragedies of Connecticut and the tragedies of Portland, Oregon and Aurora, Colorado are not accidents and one-off experiences. They're part of a continuing pattern of the diminution of human life. We need to think about that. A world in which since 9/11 we spent a little over $3 billion on Medicare, but more than $5 billion on war. We need to think about our priorities, the way we live our lives, and I would submit to you that's what Advent, as an outsider, is all about. It's being adventurous enough to look within, to see what can be done, and to begin to do it. Amen.